Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. Today we have philosopher Steven Shafarman joining us. Steven is a basic income advocate who has been writing on the topic since the 1980s. We'll talk about his book from last year, Our Future, the Basic Income Plan for Peace, Justice, Liberty, Democracy, and Personal Dignity. That's a lot of things. And more generally, we'll get into your vision for basic income. Steven, you've written several books about basic income. This is just your latest. What inspired you to start working on basic income, and how has your understanding of basic income evolved over all this time?
Well, I actually came to it in a very unique way. I was studying the way young children learn to walk and talk and make sense of the world, and began to play with that old cliche, the body politic. So as young children learn to walk, they outgrow crawling and leave it behind. And I just began to play as a thought experiment with the analogy and say, well, maybe we can collectively outgrow pollution, racism, war, and such by becoming more aware and skillful as citizens, more aware of our economic behaviors, our social behaviors, more capable of working together toward common goals and goods. And continuing the analogy, within a living being, the nervous system and the circulatory system, and indeed the whole organism, functions to maintain the health of every cell. So by analogy, I'm saying that we can consider individuals as cells in the body politic, and society, therefore, ought to ensure that everyone can manage their basic needs. And that led me to the idea of a basic income. And it was interesting, actually. I was in a PhD program at the time on another topic. And one of the faculty members who I was talking to had been a speechwriter in the White House under Jimmy Carter. And Keith and several other members of the faculty in effect said, this is all very nice, but it's much too speculative. Get yourself to the library and you'll discover that there's a long history of ideas related to guaranteed income. And that's when I began reading Thomas Paine and Milton Friedman and John Kenneth Galbraith, and tracking that whole chain. And every time I discovered another link in the chain, I became more excited and more committed, and indeed beyond committed, driven to carry these ideas as far as I could. And that's led to several books with small publishers or self-published, and it led me to drop out of that doctoral program and move to Washington, D.C., and here we are.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you mentioned people's basic needs were kind of what inspired you. Do you imagine basic income as, like you would want it at least at a level that would be sufficient for people's basic needs?
I deliberately finesse the question of the amount of the basic income.
I noticed that in the book.
I'm saying some amount with maximum freedom for people to move wherever they want, to choose lifestyles according to their interests and desires. So yeah, ideally, $1,000 a month is a nice amount, enough so that you could manage your basic needs if you were unemployed. But even $1,000 a month, even $500 a month, especially for each member of a couple, is a significant boost than what the very poor are living on today, particularly because it's guaranteed. And people will be able to plan that they're going to have that income next month and in 6 months and in a year. So the amount really is secondary, but it was always interesting to me at meetings of the US Basic Income Network. I've been at almost all of their meetings back to 2002, when we had our first big conference in New York City. There would always be people who would say, no, it has to be at least $2,000 a month, and we have to ensure that everyone can manage their basic needs, and we cannot cut other programs. And my view is much more open and flexible.
Well, some amount of money is always going to be better than no money, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So is there anything you believed strongly about basic income early on that you've kind of turned around on, or have you been kind of consistent the whole way?
I think I've been fairly consistent, and I attribute that to the fact that I came to this idea in such a unique way. I'm not a trained economist. I'm not an academic. I'm an independent scholar who works hard to be a rigorous thinker about all of these issues, and especially to question the conventional wisdom and conventional notions about left or right or liberal or conservative, and to present basic income in effect as basic common sense.
Yeah. So what would you say, or do you have an idea, like a sense of what you think the most important thing people need to understand about basic income is?
I think the most important thing to understand is that it truly is imperative. And my subtitle, which you nicely read, Peace, Justice, Liberty, Democracy, and Personal Dignity, and I am convinced that we can achieve all of that in relatively short order if we start with a basic income. I'm not saying it will be quick or easy, but with some type of basic income, individuals will also have monthly reminders that we are citizens with a direct stake in working together to solve all of these other problems.
So basic income is imperative because right now we don't have these things, and with a basic income we could.
Yes, and more fundamentally, and again, with a basic income, everyone will have monthly reminders that we are citizens with a direct stake in working together. Our political situation right now is so fraught, and countless people talk about how divided and dysfunctional our political system is, and how polarized and partisan. And basic income for me is a way to bridge all of those divides. And that's one of the metaphors I frequently use in the book and in my conversations, is of building bridges and working together to span our differences.
So here's a question. What if the basic income isn't monthly? What if it's a continuous payout and there's no like discrete event that might remind you? I guess checking your bank account balance and knowing it's higher might be the reminder.
Yeah, and however, it doesn't have to be, it could be weekly, it could be at various times through the month, and I can imagine lots of ways to do that. And as long as it is periodic and you know that it's coming.
So when you say periodic, does that mean it can't be continuous?
Well, what do you envision as a continuous basic income? You get a few dollars every day, or?
No, I would imagine that the amount of money in your bank account is calculated based on subtracting time points. So if you refresh 5 seconds later, you have 5 seconds more of basic income, for example.
Fine, I have no problem.
All right. So do you think what would you say is the most fundamental problem that basic income solves that kind of opens things up to be able to address these other problems?
The most fundamental problem, again, is the fact that most of us are somewhat alienated from our government. Most of us, on the left and the right, feel that government is not really working. People have felt that for decades. Going back to the Vietnam War and perhaps long before, people feel disenfranchised. People feel that government primarily serves the interests of wealthy elites, that the two parties are each controlled by some wealthy elite. And so the most basic problem basic income solves is, again, monthly reminders that we are citizens, and in a true democracy, you and I and the other people who listen to this right now and in the future ought to have an equal voice in our government with Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey and Barack Obama and every other American, in theory. as equals.
Okay, well, let's say instead of a basic income, the government sends out a monthly reminder email saying, you are a citizen, we care about you, we're working on all these different ways to get you involved. Is that, would that be a reasonable alternative to basic income?
No, because economic security is imperative. And people need to know that they can manage their basic needs. And just the reminder is, like so much political rhetoric, not very convincing.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Well, Steve basically said this, but I mean, just a message is like cheap talk. I mean, you could be a really selfish dictator and tell everybody like that you were being great to them, and I want to remind you that I love you every month. But basic income is proof, as he said, because it actually means that the government is functioning in a way that benefits all of the people. Like for some reason, like the power balance is such that resources are being directed towards citizens equally. So that can't be faked, right? That's not like a fake signal. And so that's really different than just some kind of message, which I think is what Stephen was saying.
Yes, and that's really my core idea, is that we have to take abstract ideas and make them concrete and make them directly meaningful in people's lives. So talk about personal dignity, for example, talk about liberty, talk about the pursuit of happiness. And basic income makes those concepts concrete because individuals will know that they have the means and incentives to make good decisions for themselves and their families.
So I guess what I'm getting at with this line of questioning is it really the message that's important, or is it the money that's important?
Well, the money conveys the message and makes it concrete.
It's not the same message if you don't have the money, essentially.
Yeah, and this again goes back to Enlightenment philosophers and to America's founders, that, to quote Franklin Delano Roosevelt, necessitous men are not free men. If people are worried about how they're going to pay their bills next month, if they're worried about how they're going to eat or provide for their families, we are easily manipulated and coerced. And some basic income is a means to ensure that everyone has the dignity and liberty to pursue happiness in whatever ways we choose.
Okay. So here's another question. If you're imagining a world that already has a basic income in it, and you meet someone in this world and you ask that person what problem the basic income solves, what do you think they're going to say?
In a world where we already have basic income, I don't think we would be asking that question.
Well, you're an outsider and you notice this basic income thing, so you ask that person.
I wouldn't be asking people what problem does it solve. I would be talking to people about what are their dreams and goals and what does basic income free them to do. And there are people who would want to be full-time parents or full-time poets, or other people who want to be entrepreneurs and invent things and create new business opportunities, or some who might want to amass a great fortune so they can do something even on a grander scale. So I'm always urging people to think about the possibilities and the opportunities. And again, getting back to my original launching point about how is it that young children learn to walk and talk and make sense of the world? Well, we learn by playing and exploring and imitating and anticipating and dreaming. And what do I want to do when I grow up? And what would be fun and exciting for me as I live my life? And I see basic income as a way to facilitate greater opportunities for everyone, and not just as individuals, but greater opportunities for us in small groups and in our society as a whole.
Yeah, you're emphasizing a lot, and you do in the book as well, that basic income frees people up. It gives people freedom to kind of live their lives how they want to live. And I guess I'm curious, do you view that freedom as kind of a continuum, or is there some kind of threshold that you cross where it's like you weren't free, now you got to a certain point and you're free?
No, I don't see any threshold like that. I think we are all somewhat free, and we are all somewhat imprisoned by our desires and our habits and our circumstances, and we can all seek to be more free and more independent and more fully and uniquely ourselves.
Would you then want to figure out the kind of the maximum level of basic income that kind of our world could handle?
I think economics suggests that things are self-adjusting, and if the amount gets too high, that will just lead to inflation, and the money will be devalued, and
then the amount won't be too high anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's kind of like what I like to say about it. And I noticed you talking here about in the book you mentioned the basic income maybe adjusting based on what's needed to kind of keep the economy balanced and stable and that kind of thing. That's kind of in my line of thinking too. So in terms of jobs, you talk a lot about.
Yeah, jobs is another one of those 4-letter words that we have to be very careful with.
Okay, so I will be careful with that word by allowing you to talk about jobs and unemployment and how you think about those things and how you think about them as relating to basic income.
I focus on personal dignity and individual liberty, and I want people to be free to be unemployed and give people the freedom to be poets or artists or full-time parents. And I listen to the way politicians and economists and in the media, and indeed almost everyone in our culture, talks about jobs as if jobs are the organizing principle for individual lives and for families and for society as a whole. And I always come back to that wonderful idea of the Declaration of Independence, that we are pursuing life, liberty, and happiness, and that we have to do so collectively. And the way people talk about jobs, it's as if there's an asterisk: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but only if you get a job first.
Or even life, liberty, and the pursuit of jobs.
Yeah, and
yeah.
Again, if we just listen to politicians and if we're critical of the conventional rhetoric, we see a lot of absurdities of that sort.
So here's a question. Is it ever good, and to what extent is it good for people to have to depend on jobs for money?
I want to speak on behalf of personal liberty and dignity and free us from the coercion of jobs. And in some of the classic basic income literature, one of the early philosophers, economists, Philippe van Parijs, used the figure of the Malibu surfer.
Yeah.
And if someone wants to spend their life surfing, that's their choice. And they will be making minimal demands on the environment. They won't be buying fancy new cars or yachts. They'll be happily surfing. And Buckminster Fuller, who I quote in the book and who's one of my heroes, said that the way to deal with technological unemployment is that anyone who loses their job to technology ought to be guaranteed an income and the freedom to do whatever they want with it. And his illustration was, and maybe some people will just go fishing, but perhaps one of them will invent a new way to fish and will contribute to all of humanity by that invention or discovery.
Well, that sounds good to me. So I guess another way to kind of come at this question is, does it ever make sense to pay people to do things?
Sure. If there are things you want done, and each of us has limited amount of time, and I would love to have the resources to pay someone to handle basic errands for me, and there are things like TaskRabbit and various kinds of gig work, and we have accountants and lawyers, and sure, it makes sense to pay people to do things. And those who want to do more things will have to find the income or have the employment or the creativity to pay people to do some of the things for them. Of course. But again, what I'm concerned with is the person who's being paid to do things, and that everyone ought to have the freedom to say no. You know, I don't want to take that job. I don't want to do that task for you. I'd rather spend this time with my kids or writing philosophy or walking on the beach.
Yeah, I think there's an important distinction to draw here between the individual and what the individual is free to do. So maybe any individual is free to say no to any particular job or that kind of thing. And then in terms of society as a whole, you know, that there's enough incentive so that someone does the work that society wants done or something, but it doesn't have to be any particular person or that kind of thing.
Yeah, and sense. In a market-based society, I think there will always be people, even with a fairly generous basic income, there will always be people who are willing to work and want to have more money and more opportunities that come with more money. And so if they will take jobs, if provided those jobs are sufficiently interesting or sufficiently remunerative. And you know.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to raise whether sort of, let's say the government is paying the basic income, whether the government would ever face a trade-off in terms of the amount of basic income between the amount of kind of freedom people are given and the amount of productivity in the economy, like the amount of stuff that people are able to buy, or if I'm not thinking about that clearly. I'm not sure if I'm thinking about it clearly yet, but it's the amount, you know, of how much people are given.
Yeah, any amount gives everyone some degree of personal freedom and the dignity to say no to a job. Yep. And I think any amount, therefore, also minimizes the coercive capacity of government or of the very rich. Government, I think, would never try to take it away or reduce the amount. The cliche about Social Security is the third rail of politics, because if you touch it, you get electrocuted. Well, basic income will be the third rail times 10 or 100 or 1,000, because it's universal. So they won't be trying to take it away. And again, I come back to the point that with the basic income, each of us will have a monthly reminder that we are citizens with a direct stake in making our government more responsive, more efficient, more accountable.
Do you think that I mean, I guess I'm trying to separate the money part from the reminder part still, and maybe I shouldn't be. But the idea that, you know, the money itself, I mean, like, people need a source of money so they can buy stuff, right? If you don't have money, you can't, you know, there's something kind of fundamental there too, right? It's not like,
well, but some of that stuff is basic food and shelter.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they don't need to have any feelings toward the government or whether the government cares about them or anything to benefit from that food and shelter that they're able to buy with the money, right?
Well, again, I come back to the Declaration of Independence and the idea that we have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that these rights are equal and apply to all of us. And one of the points that I make, and I discuss this somewhat throughout, but especially in the appendix, is the recent scholarship indicates that in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is followed by a comma. And in the early drafts, Jefferson used a semicolon. And the next phrase is to secure these rights, Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And so what we see very clearly when we look at the whole statement is that we collectively have an interest, a stake, a need to work together and ensure that government is serving our interests and securing our unalienable rights.
Well, anytime there's a discussion of rights or justice or anything like that, I kind of feel like it begs the question of why have we decided that these things are rights? Why are we going to try to, yeah.
And again, one of the tricky little words that I'm always wary of is we. And it's no one specifically made that decision. There is no collective we. And I mentioned I had a good friend and mentor when I was writing my first book. And Bob would always say, there is no we. And it's one of the core ideas that I discuss in a few places in the book, is that there is no we except when individuals voluntarily associate themselves. So when politicians use the word we, I'm always asking who specifically is included in that. And did those people choose to be included, or are you just asserting somehow that they are your voters, or they are your constituents, or that you are acting in their interests? And we the people is just a vague abstraction, except when we are active citizens.
Yeah, you say we is valid only when it's voluntary. And I think it's cool that you're kind of drawing these semantic lines and kind of clarifying things in certain ways. But I also think it's useful to, when you're talking to a person, to be charitable in terms of their meaning, right? Like when I said we, you know what I meant. You didn't need to go on a, right?
Well, I'm charitable when I'm talking to you and to other people. Okay. I'm less charitable when I'm listening to politicians making assumptions on my behalf and saying that they know what's best for me and my family or my community.
Yeah. So I guess to rephrase my question, it's why have these things been decided to be rights? And you don't have to answer that, but generally speaking, when someone says something is a right for me, so this is me being kind of pedantic or whatever, but when someone says something is a right, that's never the answer, right? That's never the full answer. It's like, why did that thing become a right? Why was it decided that thing should be a right? Let's go to Bethany.
So now I'm trying to remember. Oh, right. We were talking before about the difference between like the influence of a basic income on how people feel about their government versus the influence of just having the money. So I was just going to offer, like, as a thought experiment, I know you, for example, have come up with a scheme that would, in theory, give people a basic income through a separate entity that isn't the government, right? Like some additional company or something like that, some nonprofit. And so, you could imagine that if a nonprofit succeeded somehow in giving everyone a basic income, just as a thought experiment, obviously there's complexities there, but like you would have the money to spend and that would have a tremendous impact, but you wouldn't necessarily have this other impact of proving that the government can come together and do something that's really beneficial for the people. And this is something that I hadn't really thought that much about, but I can certainly see that would have an additional benefit where you might start to see people possibly be more optimistic about the government solving other problems like climate change and so on. And if it comes through an entity outside of the government, if that could happen, then you might not see those kinds of effects on sort of people's trust in the government or morale around the government and things like that. So I don't know if that's relevant to that.
And you mentioned climate change, and we can talk about climate change or world peace, and there are a lot of big complex problems, social justice, and we need some means to act collectively in order to make progress in these areas. And this is why I feel very strongly that we need a basic income through government, and that private experiments and private entities and cryptocurrencies are useful ideas, and we can play with them and they can maybe provide some added information about how basic income would operate, but ultimately we need to do this through our government to ensure that everyone is included and to ensure that everyone has some incentives to see the common interests and to pursue our collective. And a very related idea is about infrastructure. And private corporations are not going to build mass transit systems in Boston or Washington, D.C. or New York. And they're not going to take on the responsibility of maintaining transit or bridges or roads. And in common discourse over the last few decades, and any day you turn on the news and we hear debates about politics and infrastructure and who's going to pay for it and how will those decisions be made. And a point that I mentioned in the book is that the word infrastructure is relatively recent. In the early 80s, the term was first entering the discourse and was used in quotation marks in the New York Times and the Washington Post and elsewhere. And I live in Washington, D.C. I run into lots of people who are involved in politics, and before the pandemic, I would regularly go to events at think tanks and on Capitol Hill. And a question that I love to ask, especially of the liberal Democrats who believe that government should be doing lots of things, is before the word infrastructure, what did we call all that stuff? Mass transit and bridges and roads and sewers.
Well, I know the answer, but that's just because I read the book.
Yeah, and the common term before the early 80s was public works. And I think what basic income does and what we need it for is to reassert the value of the public and that our collective interests.
Would you say that the government providing a basic income is a form of public works?
Yes, I think that's absolutely. And we have the old phrase commonwealth. And Massachusetts and 5 other states are legally defined as a commonwealth. Massachusetts, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Virginia.
I think it's just those 4.
It might be just those. I think there are 5, but DC, when it becomes the 51st state, hopefully soon, will be Douglas Commonwealth.
Douglas Commonwealth.
Yeah. And
is that Frederick Douglass, or?
That is Frederick Douglass, who lived in DC for the last few decades of his life.
It's not C.H. Douglas?
Frederick Douglass.
Yeah. Cool. So this is kind of a tangent question.
Commonwealth is, I think, just a wonderful concept. And,
yeah. So this is just So this is just a tangent question, but why is it better for DC to be a state rather than like to be reabsorbed into Maryland?
First of all, DC doesn't want to be reabsorbed into Maryland, and Maryland doesn't want DC to be reabsorbed into it. And DC as a state would have sovereignty and control over our public elections and public life. And DC currently is really a colony, and the US Congress routinely debates DC's budget, especially when Republicans control the Congress and the White House. They regularly override actions of our elected city council.
All right, fair enough. So Joan has a question.
Yeah, this is going back to the start, the assumption that everyone who can pursue something would like personal freedom, would be able to use it productively, that's a given. And I'm not sure of that. This is something that comes up all the time when we talk about basic income, and that is the giving of agency, free time, personal choice, a room of one's own, or however you want to phrase it, is definitely a positive thing for the people I know, and for myself, and people that I associate with. But there's also the point that there are people who find freedom to be a burden.
Yes.
And the question about that has to do with you talked about children, and I think that's interesting because they do imitate and they do experimentation, and they learn that way. But it's also true that there are different kinds of children, and some children are more interested in what they're being told to do than others. Some children take to structures like school much more easily than others. And those children kind of crave a certain order or a certain authority, something that's anathema to me or to maybe to us. There's a need for it in some people.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, it's sort of a broad brush to say, well, basic income gives everybody personal freedom, personal choice. They can be creative, they can be poets, they can be business entrepreneurs, and all of the things that you talked about in the beginning. But it's also true that some people don't want that.
Yeah.
And so,
absolutely.
Yeah. And so that assumption, I question, even though I agree with it for me personally and for people I know. I question that.
Yeah, well, one of the people who wrote about this back in the 60s during the early, very serious debates about guaranteed income was the psychologist Eric Fromm.
Oh, yeah, I know who that is. Yep.
He said, there are people who are alienated, who are dissociated, who will just waste their basic income and waste their lives. And but alienation is acquired through bad education and through bad socialization. And
well, that's what I wondered, if you thought that was a corruption, if you think that's a corruption of the original impulse. Yeah.
When I think about young children and how we learn to walk and talk, I think we are naturally curious and eager to learn and eager to contribute and eager to be part of families and societies.
But there's also the Lord of the Flies metaphor. And
and if we look at some of the literature on basic income, the Lord of the Flies metaphor is been forcefully challenged. And
there were some kids off New Zealand or something who got stranded on an island
in
for a year, and they ended up, yeah.
So
what is that example? That's a real life example of people stranded. Oh, okay, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, and they did great, the kids, and then they got rescued. Yeah. I mean, I think an important a question here that might help kind of clarify this is we can ask, why is there such a thing as a job? And there's such a thing as a job in the first place because there's work that people wouldn't ordinarily do unless you paid them. So that's the whole reason why we have jobs. So the very fact that people kind of need that, it has to be an adaptation to something, right? It's not like, and maybe it's hardwired to some extent. I mean, Bethany knows more about this stuff, but it's all it's a product of incentives. You feel comfortable in a job because you have an incentive to feel comfortable in the job. Like that's something that we've adapted to.
We've been socialized that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Other societies do it differently, and early human societies certainly did it differently.
But there's also a drive to perform chores, perform tasks, to do work, even if it's not paid for.
Right. So most of the work that we do is not paid, right?
Right.
The labor market and jobs is only for everything else. It's not. And certainly there's stuff that's just in our psychology, and then we can ask, if our psychology tells us that we want to go to war and fight this battle, should we always be going to war and fighting battles, or can we play sports instead, or something like that, right? So there's ways when the psychology is no longer useful, there's ways to.
But our psychology doesn't tell us to go to wars. It's national leaders who have accrued great power and who want to increase their power and increase their wealth and influence, who tell us to go to wars, and they concoct all kinds of slogans and.
Sure. Well, let's go to Bethany, because I think she knows, she is an expert on this.
Yeah, I was going to say that on all of these points, human psychology is highly flexible in terms of, at least from starting from birth, and socializable. So I think it's a slightly, like Joan's question, it kind of depends on whether you're talking about people now who are already, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 now, or people who would be brought up in a society that had a basic income as a normal thing, once things had adjusted. Yeah. I think the answer is quite different for those two different situations. And I think Joan also alluded to this in her question in the text, in the chat as well, that it might depend partly on socialization. And so, I think that you might have to smooth things over or in different ways for people who are already used to this culture. But I wonder if we overstate that, only because you do see, we do have the example of people retiring. And that can be really difficult for some people. So maybe that's an example of some of the problems, but it's also really enjoyable for a lot of people. And a lot of people find that even despite a whole lifetime of focusing on their work, they're able to do lots of other things and they're able to fill their time. And so I don't know how pessimistic I am about the adjustment. I think that it might depend. But I think that what is difficult or what is confusing a lot of times is that there are a lot of things that get confounded with having a job when you're kind of quote unquote supposed to have.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, for example, first of all, it's your only way of getting money. So you see all sorts of mental health and other effects of unemployment, partly because people don't have money, but also it's a status thing. And here you'd see a difference between retired people and unemployed younger people, because when you're retired, it's not a status problem. Like, it's expected that you might retire when you're older, and that's not detrimental to your reputation, but that's not the case for being unemployed or on social services or whatever when you're younger. So I think, for all those reasons, if you look at unemployed people who are supposed to have a job who are not retirement age, it's really not going to tell you that much about what would happen with a basic income. Even if you just are talking about people who were socialized to have a job and then have a basic income and lose their job or whatever. So I think those are some things to keep in mind. And then I guess the last thing is that nobody's taking all work off the table. So I guess it depends on how gradual versus abrupt things are. But you could imagine that there is still work that needs doing, and people will still want to do that. And so if you have any kind of natural distribution, as Joan is saying, in kind of who wants to have structured work, then those people might seek that out, and they might even need to be paid less because they kind of enjoy that or value it or get something out of it. And so that structure, I don't think anyone's proposing that option of paid work is going away. I think if we do less of it, I think there'll be at least a while where the people who are happy to do nothing, not do nothing, to do no paid work, will be the ones who don't take the jobs that are still needed, and the people who want the structure will take them. So it might sort itself out more than you might think.
I think it will absolutely sort itself out, and there will be people who want the added income or want the added prestige, or who will take jobs, and there will be people who are reluctant to take jobs who will do so if the jobs are sufficiently well paid or the hours are structured appropriately. And there will be all kinds of uncertainties during the transition period. And I think that's a good argument for starting with a smaller basic income. So if the initial basic income is, say, $500 a month or $700 a month for every adult citizen, then people will know they can manage their survival needs. Whereas and many will still want jobs and the added earnings and prestige that comes with a job. It becomes more problematic if you insist that the basic income has to be $2,000 a month, as some people might say. Or
so this is related.
There are people who are alienated. There are people who have just adapted to being inherently lazy and unproductive, and they'll have a basic income, so they won't be committing crimes. They won't be panhandling. They'll be citizens to whatever extent they choose to be citizens, and the rest of us won't have to worry about them.
So Austin has his hand up, but before we get to him, Anna had asked a question in the YouTube live chat. She's asking, what do you think is the most approachable barrier to basic income to try to dismantle? Or maybe another way to put it is, what is the low-hanging fruit right now on the path towards implementing a basic income?
Well, I think we're about to cross that and pick that fruit, and that is the child tax credit that people will start receiving in just 2 weeks. Awesome. And this is something that many of us in the basic income world have talked about for years. And it's hugely exciting to see that it will be implemented. And again, the low-hanging fruit is that people might be skeptical of a basic income for adults, but even the conservatives and libertarians and folks who are generally anti-government for a long time have said, yeah, but society has a responsibility to ensure that children can manage their basic needs, and you can't give the money directly to the children, so you have to give it to their parents. And we're going to see what that does to our political discourse and what that does to our economic lives, and how that helps countless families, including families in rural areas and families who have been so neglected and alienated from society. And it's going to be hugely exciting. And even if it initially only goes through the end of the year, Biden and the Democrats are actively pushing for it to be made permanent, or at least to be extended for a couple more years. And
just for the record, how much money am I going to get? One child?
It's one child. It's $300 a month up to the age of 6, and $250 a month up to the age of 16 or 17.
Sounds good.
And it's paid directly it's a direct cash payment. People are, it's just expanding the existing child tax credit and making it what they say fully refundable and paid monthly instead of with tax refunds in April.
Right. Cool. So Austin has a chainsaw in his background. So instead of calling on him, I'm going to read his question. He's in Australia. He says, Australia is a commonwealth at the federal level. We have a historically strong egalitarian spirit and a strong labor movement. But that is now a problem for basic income advocates here, because the union movement dominated progressive politics and is generally uncomfortable with a basic income because it upsets the laborist approach in general. How do we navigate that?
Yes, Austin, and I've spent time in Australia and had some of those conversations, and that was a major point in the 1960s in the basic income debates. And within the Democratic Party, when people were starting to advocate for a basic income and Martin Luther King was campaigning for it, the laborists and the unions were saying, no, what we should guarantee instead is jobs. And of course, with the focus on jobs, then you have more power to employers and more power to labor unions, and continuing conflicts between unions and workers and the employers. And my way of navigating it is always to come back to first principles about personal dignity and individual liberty and who decides what's best for you and your family, and understanding that labor unions in some ways and circumstances can be a real obstacle to progress, just as wealthy employers and wealthy individuals can be obstacles to progress. And we all tend to default to what is familiar, and the people who have economic or political power will do whatever they can to see the world from their vantage point, seeking to maintain that power. And so ultimately it comes back to something like a peaceful democratic revolution. And again, that's why I always come back to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and a government to secure these rights. And if government is failing to secure these rights, then we have the right to alter or abolish that government and to institute a new one.
Well, you have very, very different first principles when it comes to basic income compared to me. And I think that was evident throughout the book, and obviously from what you're saying just there. For me, it's much less political and much less, less justice oriented, less rights oriented. It's just about the money, right? You need a way to get people money so they can buy stuff. And then the question is, if you don't have basic income, what mechanism are you going to use to try to get people their money? And then you can compare these mechanisms. And When you choose a broken mechanism, then yeah, you're going to see all these complicated problems. So you're talking about really complicated, stuff. It's you try to condense it down and really focus on these first principles, but people have very strong associations with what those things mean. And for some people, the pursuit of happiness means don't give anyone anything they didn't earn or something like that, right? So that's it's tricky. I think there's like you've done a great job like keeping the book short and simplifying a lot of the complexity, but there's a lot of complexity that's still there that I'm not sure is necessary to start with. You know what I mean?
Well, these are big, bold ideas, and there's a lot of complexity, and it's how do we present it clearly and directly, and that's why I always focus on individuals and what do you want for yourself and your family.
I never focus on that. I think that's a terrible idea, because you're looking at something that's going to affect the overall system that we're all interacting in, right? And you can't answer questions about the system by asking individual people how they would respond to a particular thing.
Yes, but the system is composed of individuals.
Sure.
And again, I started with this image of the body politic and individuals as cells in the body politic. And for a healthy society or a healthy person, we have to ensure that all of those cells are getting their nutrients and having their waste products removed, and the health of the individual leads to the health of the society.
Yeah, I think there are some people who aren't convinced that. I think if you just say that, healthy individuals lead to a healthier society, I think most people would be on board with that. I don't think everyone's on board with the idea that basic income is what leads to the healthiest individuals.
But getting back to your point, we have to ensure that people have the means to meet their basic needs, and we have to distribute money somehow or other to make that happen. And my answer is, well, what would be the most direct and efficient way to do all of that?
There you go. That's more my kind of language.
Yeah, well, and I agree absolutely. And by presenting it in that way, I find that I get a lot of support from people who identify as libertarians and conservatives, and and within the basic income community, and we used to have these discussions periodically, most people identify as left libertarian. That is, like we recognize the need for government, we just want it to be minimal.
Yeah, and you talk in the book about minimizing the size of government. And it occurs to me that people mean different things when they say that. Sometimes they mean the amount of money that goes through the government needs to be minimized. And sometimes they mean like the amount of complicated bureaucracy that, and processes and stuff that the government, goes through in administering everything needs to be simplified, right? And I think there are a lot of people who don't really distinguish between the two. They think bigger government, more money, more inefficiency, more bureaucracy, right? And I'm curious because I think you're emphasizing the complexity part of it and wanting to simplify the government rather than kind of the amount of money that's being spent. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to return power to individuals and communities and say that government is best that is most local and most amenable to influence by the individuals within that area.
Okay.
And again, it comes back to Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and James Madison, and all of those guys were thinking about these issues in the context of Enlightenment ideas. And they were, back in the day when we didn't have Twitter and we didn't have Zoom and we didn't have radio and television, people would read serious books and debate ideas with their friends and try to figure things out. And
you're saying I can't get them on the podcast in a few weeks?
I wish you could, man. That would be delightful.
Yeah, we actually did one discussing Thomas Paine and agrarian justice a while back. Let's go to one final question from Joan. Sorry, I'm gonna unmute you here. Here we go.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm still, Austin. Yeah, I'm still kind of stuck on this idea of the psychology behind it and the politics behind the acceptance of basic income, just as a principle. And the fact that some people, it's not about how they get their money necessarily through a job. It's not about wanting to keep a job because of greed or status necessarily, but wanting to be told what to do. And I think that is a, we saw that in Germany. We saw that some people, and we saw that recently in our politics, that some people don't know what to do with their lives and they want to be told what to do. A job does that for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it gives them a sense that they belong to a society, they're doing the right thing, they're pleasing an authority figure. They're not interested in personal freedom per se.
So I'm going to interrupt you because I think we acknowledged this before, and it sounds like you weren't satisfied with the response.
I wasn't really because, because you keep going back to the idea that people might be wasting their lives or they'd be unproductive, or I feel like you're not addressing the deeper need that some people have not to be free.
Well, and if some people have such a need, they can have jobs and they can find gurus or political leaders or employers who will tell them what to do. And
right, but it's not I don't think it's a small number of people. I mean, it's not. I don't think they're outliers.
Nobody's saying that it's a small number of people, and we might not even, it might not even be reasonable to ask them to go find these things on their own. Like, we might have to put resources into providing structure for the people who clearly need it or something like that. But that's a separate issue, or it's a separate problem from the problem of how to distribute money to people.
Well, yeah,
right?
that's how you think about it. I know, Alex, but I also think about it the way that Stephen is talking about the philosophy behind it, and the deeper needs that people have for freedom and creative expression and not to be interfered with, personal liberty, pursuit of happiness. Those are all important things. They're all important to me. But I'm saying that there's a flip side, and we see it in politics all the time, and it's not trivial.
Absolutely, and there will be a lot of adjustments on the parts of individuals and families and communities, and I'm sure difficulties will arise for many people, and getting back to an earlier theme, it will be very interesting to see a world where everyone has a basic income and where we're socialized to that expectation, and I want to live in that kind of world.
Well, so do I, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
And for the transition period will be rough for a lot of people, and people will feel lost and displaced, and we just have to expect that and be compassionate as we work through it.
As they are compassionate to people who don't want jobs and want a creative life, that kind of compassion, because that's not happening from the other side.
Absolutely.
Right now.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are getting toward the end. Is there any final message you want to put out there? Any final thing you want to say, Stephen?
I have enjoyed this conversation immensely, and I would be happy to continue it with any of you individually. And the book is Our Future, the Basic Income Plan for Peace, Justice, Liberty, Democracy, and Personal Dignity. And it's available online. And
and it's very short, especially if you don't read the
appendices. I worked hard to keep it short and concise and very accessible, because too much of the literature about basic income and most every issue is by serious thinkers who seem to be writing to impress their friends and colleagues, And my focus from the beginning is how can we present things in a way that might spark a mass movement to demand that it happen.
Okay. All right. Well, appreciate all the effort you're putting in, Stephen. This is a great discussion. Next week, we have an artist by the name of Keiko Sono joining us, and she's going to talk about art as it relates to basic income. So looking forward to that discussion.
Thank you all.